Very happy that you all are here. I missed my friend John, as I'm sure we all do. And we are here today to honor his life and his work. His wife, Mary Dewitt, is here with us today. Other families are here as well. We're so here. Thank you that you are here. I also want to acknowledge a very long time and dear friend and publisher of his later books, Paul Ezek. You're here also as well. Thank you, Paul, for always for being such a good friend to our friend. John, as you know, was a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice. We are so pleased that Beth Ritchie, Department Chair, is here today. Beth is back there. Thank you so much, Beth. Want to make sure that you all know, too, that on April 18th, the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice will be holding their annual alumni event, during which time they will be honoring John. So, Beth Ritchie, thank you so much. It's so important to us that you are here. Thank you. There are other colleagues here from UIC today. I hate to start naming them for fear I will leave someone out. I know that Dave Stovall is here, and Professor Dick Simpson is here. I think other colleagues are coming as well, but thank you also for being here. And of course, as always, I want to thank the staff at the Great Cities Institute. Without them, we can't do any of this. But I especially want to acknowledge Christiana Kinder. John really loved Christiana. Christiana, right here. You were really special to him, and he made that known. So, Christiana, thank you for everything you've done to help make this event possible. John and I occasionally would spar, but only in relation to the Bulls and the Bucks. So even until the very end, we were texting back and forth all the time about the Bulls and the Bucks. The only other time that I can remember sparring with John was over which one of us knew our first speaker longer. John had the idea that we should have an event to honor his mentor and noted ethnographer Joan Moore. John was always texting me or calling me up saying, hey, how about we do this? Or how about you guys should do this? Or always an organizer. So he had this idea that we should do a conference on Latino gang researchers. And as he was telling me who we should invite, he mentioned that we should invite Abelardo Valdez. I said, I know Lalo. And then he said, well, I know Lalo too. He says, because I've known him longer. I said, no, I've known him longer. I've known him for 35 years. And John said, well, I've known him for almost 50. So John won that one. And I'm so pleased that we have the benefit today of hearing from one of John's colleagues and friends who knew him before John went into academia. Professor Valdez himself is a highly skilled and prolific researcher on national drug policy and has provided financial support and research experience to hundreds of young people. With great honor, I introduce my Chicano Studies colleague and longtime friend, Abelardo Valdez.
That was very kind, thank you. I have two tasks today. One of them is to talk a little bit about John, and then the other is to introduce formally Dr. Brotherton. It's true that I knew John before he was a scholar and a professor and a teacher and an author and a real advocate for criminal justice and an expert witness and all those accomplishments that all of you are probably very familiar with. But John and I met in Milwaukee in the 1960s. Can you believe that? And I remember John as being a real thin guy, right? Tall, kind of like Tom Sawyer sort of guy, but a fierce advocate and community organizer. And he he worked primarily, if you guys know Milwaukee, we have a Mason-Dixon line in Milwaukee, right? And it's the viaduct. And the viaduct, the north side in the inner city part of the city, is primarily African American, and in the south side, it's working class whites, poor whites, and Latinos. And I remember that there was open house marches back in 1968, 69, I don't even get the dates correct. It was like 100 days of marches for open housing to try to break down the laws that wouldn't allow African Americans to buy homes in that part of the city. So there was 100 days, maybe more days of marching. And I remember John was, at that time, in conversation with John because I was really working on this side of the Mason-Dixon line, and he was working at the other side of the Mason-Dixon line. And so we got into conversations about how to create unity between these two groups. And I mean, so I remember that we had a large company that was right in the middle of the south side of Milwaukee. It was called Allen Bradley. It was like really good working class jobs there, but there were no Latinos and no blacks. So John, if I remember all this correctly, right? So we decided to march from the north side of San Antonio, cross the Mason-Dixon line, across the viaduct, and I don't know if it was 16th Street or 6th Street or 16th Street, and marched into Allen Bradley right at the south side. And created just chaos, right, for that community. But John was there. John kept up with his activities with those marches. And I remember that finally Mayor Meyer at the time, who was the mayor, decided to ban the marches, would not allow the marches to continue. And John and Father Grappi, whoever you remember, I have an interesting story about Father Grappi, which I can't tell. I'll tell some of you later. But Father Grappi insisted on continuing the marches, and John was with them. And at that time is when John got beat up seriously by the police and ended up in jail, is one example of that he worked on. He also worked during that period on the Milwaukee 14, which was 14 men and women who burned their draft cards in downtown Milwaukee office, right? And he was he was a supporter of them. He wasn't one of the 14, but also ended up being very much involved in that activity as well. So he continued this continuously. We formed various groups, both on the south side, where he started working much more, with groups up on the northeast side. And it continued for years. We did this work for probably 4, 5, 6 years. And then probably in the early 80s, I left, and John was still active. Right? We kind of separated and went our separate ways. And we ended up having, over the years, John went into academia and started working with Joan Moore, and I was working with Joan Moore as well. And so years later, we connected, and we're both in academia. So this is sort of my stories about John. I could tell you a lot more about him, but I was so surprised. I'm not surprised, but here we are then, 30, 40 years later, we're both in academia, but we all have this kind of similar background. I would say that, that's right, I forgot to mention the National Welfare Rights Organization that he was also very, very involved in. But I would say that, his life is one of all of us should model ourselves after if we're really going to really confront the times that we're living in. So with great admiration, that's how I knew John. Thank you. Okay, so let me now introduce Dave Brotherton, who's also somebody I've known for many years. David is a professor, researcher, and author known for his work in the fields of sociology and criminology. particularly focused on urban gangs, youth subcultures, and issues related to social justice and inequality. He's written extensively on topics such as gang violence, juvenile justice, and the social dynamics of urban communities. And you can see why him and John were such good friends. Brotherton had held economic positions at various institutions, but he's been at John Jay College, Criminal Justice, and the Graduate Center in New York for many years. He's also been involved in community-based initiatives aimed at addressing gang violence and promoting alternatives to incarcerations for youth involved in these criminal activities. He is, his work really explores the complexity of urban life, including the intersections of race, class, and gender, and he has contributed significantly to the economic discussions on the structural factors that contribute to crime and violence in urban settings. But the thing I admire most about John's work is that he's made really important contributions to the study of Latino populations. And some of those notable contributions are in his work on Latino gangs in New York City, where he's provided insights into the formation, organizations, and activities of those gangs. His work, I would say, extends beyond academic research to advocacy for social justice and rights of marginalized communities, particularly for Latinos. He's involved in community-based initiatives and aimed at addressing the root causes of crime and violence, and promoting alternatives to incarceration and advocating for policies that support the well-being of Latino policies. He's also what I would call a critical thinker. He uses a very critical analysis in his work. But the thing that among the various things that I admire about him is his work on immigration and crime. I didn't bring my book. I think I left it over there. His book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, about the deportation of Dominicans from New York back to the Dominican Republic, is a really significant piece of research. Very few people have really done this work. This is a very important issue that's going on in this country, particularly for young Latinos that come here undocumented as children, and then for very minor infractions are deported back, not only to Santo Domingo, back to Mexico, El Salvador, Nicaragua. We have thousands of men and women who are being deported. And John's book is really kind of one of the pioneer pieces that really gets into the intricacies of this, into the intricacies of this phenomenon, and then what happens during the deportation process, and then what happens during the attempt to integrate into those societies, which they're really not very familiar with and not very welcome. So this is a phenomenon that's going all over Latin America, and John has really one of the few, he's one of the few people that has really addressed it. Sorry. So with that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to
John Swim.
David Jai. Sorry.
That's okay. But I am actually David, not John. Anyway, thanks so much to organisers, Teresa and Mary, for inviting me for this very important event. And sorry it has to be with our great man not here, which was with me and strutting our stuff and doing what we do best, which is to fight for some form of social justice that we've been yearning for many a year. I'm going to spend my allotted time discussing some of John's multifaceted work and some of his major contributions to the field that he and I have spent much of our academic careers developing, i.e. Critical gang studies. But before I do, I just wanted to describe to you my first meeting with John, although I'm not sure he would remember it. It was at the ASC, American Society of Criminology, in Miami in 1994. John was presenting his work with his team on New Jacks when I entered the room. I knew his work from our Homeboy Gang project in San Francisco under the direction of Dan Waldorf, who often spoke highly of John's people and folks text. Dan saw John as a comrade in the field, someone who, quote unquote, got the story right, as he put it. I also remember a few occasions walking into our office with Dan and John discussing our findings on the phone. I should say Dan's conversations with John were a striking contrast to Dan's dealings with another gang researcher, Malcolm Klein, whom Dan disliked intensely. Anyway, there John is, sitting in the middle, chairing the session and encouraging his younger field workers to strut their stuff. Then he gave the final summing up. John was dressed in a tropical type shirt and wore a big gold chain around his neck. I thought immediately that this might be a dude I could get on with. John spoke articulately and somewhat theatrically, which I also enjoyed. And the room in turn reacted enthusiastically to his delivery and content. After the meeting, I approached him and told him I liked what he had to say and that I was with Dan's team. He greeted me warmly. Then I said something like, "You know, John, of course you're right about deindustrialization and what these kids are facing, with the rise of gangs making total sense, given these historical circumstances. But John, why aren't you calling for socialism?" John looked at me somewhat bemusedly. "Yeah, you're right, but maybe next time." Of course, I had no idea about John's experience with Chinese Stalinism at the time. After that, we stayed in touch, and then some years later, in 2001, I, together with Luis Barrios, a fellow professor in John Jay, organised the Globalizing the Streets conference in New York City, which he took a lot of interest in. I'm sure he relished the thought of attending a conference which Mayor Rudolph Giuliani tried to ban, and committed to give a talk on his work that would become his World of Gangs book 7 years later. Following that, in 2002, he invited me to Chicago for the Gangs in the Global City meeting, where I first met Jock Young, Joan Moore, and John Pitts. So John came into my life at an incredibly propitious moment, not just intellectually, but also socially, helping me to see how I could join a community of radical scholars. These engagements and networks seem to be serendipitous, but they're not, because you're always looking forward to find, or you're always looking to find fellow travelers, and John excelled at making those kinds of connections. In short, his authenticity and honesty, directness, and commitment to unbounded radical research goals were a breath of fresh air, confirming that there could be a place for folks like me in this strange, highly competitive world where the rites and rituals of the striving middle-class professional were the norm. In contrast to the careerism and individualism that prevailed, especially at these conferences, here was someone, not this conference, the conference back there, here was someone who wasn't interested in the presentation of self, someone who didn't mince words, called people out, stood by his principles, and challenged you to argue otherwise. As he writes in his welfare book, we have to struggle, to experiment, and then sum up our experiences for others. And so I guess it's fitting that at the end of this 30-year relationship, I got to publish his last work. A text with that extraordinary passage on its penultimate page where John, in his inimitable way, faces up to his physical demise. Who would do this? I wondered when I first read it. John would. Running through all of John's work in his inexhaustible commitment to humanism, it's there in his first book as he demolishes the stereotypes of gang members and their street organisations and groups. It's there in his dissertation work on the welfare system in Milwaukee. It's there in his interpretation of the global gang phenomenon, and it's ever present in his last work as he puts the lessons of his scholarship on trial, up against the arguments and predispositions of prosecutors and judges, before the scepticism of juries, and as a slither of hope for the adjudicated and their defence lawyers. He says, we might not make it to the mountaintop, but we find purpose in that we don't stop trying. Starting in his early work in Peoples and Folks, John reminds us that much of the gang literature is out of date, a lot of it referring to a period prior to World War II. Few researchers, he found, were examining the contemporary everyday lives of gang members or paying attention to the social, economic, or political contexts of the subcultures being largely theorised. He wondered aloud what explains this absence in the literature. It's an important question and speaks to the lasting power of certain governing paradigms, and perhaps to researchers who coast on past endeavours, comfortable in their tenured positions in academic enclaves, still able to patrol the borders of the discipline and its subspecialisations. He also posits, is it because the mainly white middle-class research community does not have access to the quote-unquote deviants? Or perhaps those who do are loath to shed such light on their respective communities, all too aware of the tropes historically promulgated by outside forces. Think of Bill Bratton, arriving in Los Angeles, announcing on his arrival 1 year after 9/11 that the main terrorists America should be worried about are, well, you know, he says. Most of the city is extremely safe, but there is not enough appreciation for the destructive nature of gangs and the image the rest of the country has in some parts of the city. In the long term, gang violence in the city will destroy the city. It is in their good neighbourhood's interest to get into this fight. And then goes on, the Department of Homeland Security must focus its attention on terrorists at home. In other words, the gang member. With the media industry long given to racist and anti-working class portrayals of those at the lower end of the social hierarchy, that in turn feed an assortment of moral entrepreneurs, happily echoing the dire scenarios of policing agencies, it is hardly surprising that white supremacy, post-Jim Crow, retained so much of its legitimacy. Angela McRobbie of Birmingham School fame reminded us that life in an endless stream of moral panics makes it difficult, perhaps impossible, to make the case that many realities are, well, a social construction. Of course, now, making life in a post-truth society where policing the crisis, governing through crime, and violent overthrows of elected bourgeois democratic governments are the new norms that make discussions of what a fascist America might look like almost the daily news. It was, I should add, Jack London who wrote The Iron Heel in 1908, predicting such a future. London's dystopian novel of what happens when the oligarchy ran riot was written 120-odd years ago. John thus took the view, not unlike Philippe Bourgois, that condemnations of blackness and brownness notwithstanding, social scientists were obliged to do this research. Their job should be to deepen our own and the public's understandings of these phenomena, and that is imperative not to stay silent about the prevailing conditions in such communities, so long waiting for their American dream and pyramid of needs to be even partially met. Otherwise, the discursive terrain is left unchallenged, for those race and class interests do not lend themselves to anything approaching an objective analysis, or, as Elizabeth Hinton asks, how exactly did the war on poverty become the war on drugs? Hence, as Spinoza taught us, our task is not to laugh or cry, but to understand. And John continued in this vein, continually asking the hard questions and doing his best through collaborative methodologies to compare his findings to the research from the pioneering work of Thrasher to more recent renderings of Miller, Spergel, Jacobs and others. In his summary, he concludes that there's a bit of everything going on, but nothing that might typify the gang sufficient to function as some catch-all generalizations to solve the definitional issue. Hence, he argued that all gang research should be highly contextualized, which can only happen if researchers roll their sleeves up and collaborate with the subjects and objects of their studies in a relationship which I have come to see, when done well, as dialogical, similar to the principles adopted by Paulo Freire in his revolutionary work on literacy. Thus, using Joan Moore's questionnaire from her Los Angeles investigation, he collected interviews with the aid of his partner, a former gang member and long-time community resident, with the top dogs of Milwaukee's multiple street groups that revealed voices that until then were mostly absent from gang social science. Cloud and Olin were using data from the 30s with their theories of opportunity structures. Miller was still similarly basing his lower-class cultural pronunciamentos on work from bygone years, and Cohen never entertained the influence of race for his reflections on reaction formation. Unfortunately, John did not mention Hershey's Hobbesian concepts of social bonding, all based on surveys in a few Berkeley high schools with no actual fieldwork or painstaking interviews deemed necessary. This ideological sleight of hand, so readily adopted in endless researches on the gang other, with funds gladly doled out by the likes of NIJ, still finds little pushback. David Matzer once talked to me about how Hershey blew him out of the water at Berkeley, which I can only understand now with the help of Gramsci. Theoretically, of course, John took William Julius Wilson's findings as his cue, employing the concept of the underclass to explain and situate the corrosive impacts of deindustrialization on the mobility prospects of his subjects. While observing up close their lived social isolation and heightened levels of relative deprivation, he saw and heard loud and clear what it looked and felt like. The narratives that emerged from these deeply pathologized social actors showed how their subcultures, now fast becoming phantasmagorical objects through the omnipresent processes of social, legal, and political othering, emerged and formed over time. Their communities were fragmented and undermined by one-way busing. They didn't have the hope of learning to labour like many of their parents, but they also wanted to be part of a family, and while some have played their parts in the mix, they had little in common with organised crime, now an all-too-common trope of the FBI and the widespread use of RICO in gang cases. No, they were not brothers from another planet, nor were they genetically programmed super predators. As John aptly notes, in contrast to the criminalising projections of the social control industry, they were also far from the militaristic formations depicted in policing manuals now being disseminated widely within the nation's precincts. Alas, John's sorely needed corrective on the lived realities of our inner cities and the myriad street organisation formations did little to impede the passage of Democratic President Clinton's Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, the largest crime bill in US history, and as many have argued, a major factor in the carceral tsunami that became known as the prison industrial complex. This commitment to a radical humanistic criminology continued in his critique of welfare services and underscored his more recent project as an expert witness, a role that I have undertaken also for the past 17 years. In this work, there is no hiding behind the abstractions of scholarly debate or thick descriptions of low lives at the margins. Quite the contrary. It is all frontline stuff, fulfilling a role requiring the endurance of often long and contentious cross-examinations by lawyers trained in adversarial legal argument, energetically responding to the fictions of gang-related police trained to honour blue lines of defence, and judges who are variously disposed to upholding the basic principles of US law, i.e. innocent until proven guilty. Despite such experiences, many of which were clearly emotionally shattering, he remains convinced that the system can work if we remain resolute, principled, imaginative, and firm in our conviction that decisions of life and death can be significantly influenced by solid social scientific evidence presented within a framework that is understandable and credible. Much of this evidence comes from the subject's life histories and only emerge from interviews which rely on the skills to probe, engage, analyse, test and empathise. It also involves collecting a wide range of archival sources, all part of what Mills called our sociological craft. With so much riding on these evidences and their interpretations, we also have to pay attention to the performances, both within and without the courtroom. In deportation proceedings, I have likened them to Artaud's theatre of cruelty. For the settings, unspoken rules and rituals, agendas written and unwritten, self-presentations, intentionalities and subjectivities are crucial contributions to this extraordinary drama involving the state, its bodies of armed men, its various representatives and apparatuses, its legal codes, carceral logics, methods of punishment, and, of course, the subject objects of its internal and external methods of social control. As we approach the denouement, it is clear that so many lives will never be the same, and for some, there may not be life at all. Okay, John admits that the prejudices and prefigurative images in the heads of the players might not be overcome, but at least with our specialised knowledge and epistemological acuity, we can win some, even if we lose some. Surely this is better than settling for a foregone conclusion. However, far from displaying any idealism or magical thinking, he likens his efforts to the myth of Sisyphus, as interpreted in Camus' existential renderings. He compares his perhaps absurdist urges to continuing to push the rock up the hill because, well, who else is going to do it? And anyway, how can we sit by and let things stand? This decision to recognise and to accept the different moral imperatives to intervene are with us all the time. But seen through the existentialist lens, isn't it also a way to revolt? To engage in an act of refusal by arguing against business as usual in the cause of freedom. For me, this deep regard for moral character and fibre are present in all John's work, demonstrating a courage and an integrity to speak out against injustice and social harm, both large and small. As James Scott reminds us, socio-political resistance comes in many forms, from sabotage on the shop floor to disrupt capitalist production relations to fighting for a moral economy against the diktats of rural landlords. Today we face many threats in our respective institutions of higher learning to freedom of speech, both in and outside the classroom, with this moral imperative to speak out never more important. Nonetheless, like me, he sees too many in our occupation staying out of the fray, keeping their heads below the parapet while sitting comfortably in privileged positions, carefully tending their reputations. Although many have the means and skills to make a difference, they have no voluntad, no ganas to do so. When I came into the profession, I remember presenting to folks who frequently had a contrary position to my own, but were higher up the totem pole. The comment most often uttered after my presentation was how passionate I was about the work, as if it were a failing, a flaw. What they really meant was that the research was too political, too ideologically suspect, of worst of all, how I rejected the scientism of orthodox positivism. In other words, where are the numbers, the graphs, the survey results? Why don't I call on the datasaurus, a la Jock Young, to boost my validity? Gratifyingly, I never saw John yield to such conventional arrogance and the often attendant qualities of intellectual opportunism and pusillanimity. Rather, he seemed to enjoy the dueling aspects of the struggle for empirical and theoretical clarity. Meanwhile, the many students he has mentored, who have come my way, all speak of his example, both in the field and in the classroom, and how he modelled for them the various qualities of an activist scholar. He showed that it was not just rhetoric, and isn't that what Rosa taught us? John's collaborative work with Doudney in his globalistic shift was pivotal. He travelled widely, spending time in the global south that brought him face to face with the dimensions of the immiseration Marx had long called a law and inevitable product of capitalist production relations and exchange that had been taking place especially since the widespread adoption of neoliberal economic doctrine and its complementary security state policies and practices of structural violence. It was no coincidence that we saw a global increase of both prison and deportation populations, basically the surplus populations of the working classes to complement the neoliberal counter-revolution, what Jock Young referred to as the exclusive society. Meanwhile, Mike Davis, was warning of the planet of slums, now a fait accompli, while also forecasting the environmental devastation of California made inevitable by the profit motive in private property development. So many of the world's youth now face these dystopic futures, living within intricate urban borders, defensible spaces, John called them, where security services were absent except for sporadic operational invasions to keep the natives on their toes. Demands for basic services usually went unheeded by corrupt or mismanaged local authorities, hampered by a country's indebtedness either to Western banks or increasingly the Chinese state. Poverty was the norm, not just the relative but the absolute kind, with mobility a possibility only for those who emigrated or who could have usually shortened lives in organised crime groups using gang members as their foot soldiers. What are these youth supposed to resort to, asked John. What happens to their adolescent dreams, hopes and imaginations? What are their role models? What does their culture consist of and where does it come from? How does the drug trade function now that the US's misbegotten war on drugs has been a spectacular $47 billion per year failure? $47 billion per year failure. $47 billion per year failure. To ask the questions is almost to answer them, as theories of deviance amplification can be readily applied to country after country where the IMF orders its supply-side strategies, both economic and militarily, to be adopted without a social, economic or moral thought given to the roots of the transgressive behaviour in these criminogenic environments. In response to the massive cuts in social expenditure, the end of price supports to key foodstuffs and fuel, the thinning and often the destruction of state ministries and institutions for the benefit of the poor, the decimation of public health provisions and the curtailment of educational opportunities at all ends of the spectrum, you get a debacle as seen in Ecuador since 2017. This is the place where I've been working for the last 17 years. It is one of the most extreme examples of just how bankrupt our national and international ruling classes are in their perpetuation of a global system of super-exploitation of labour and natural resources. Please don't be under the impression that the lessons of that country are just for the global south. But how does a country with arguably the world's most sustained drop in homicide turn into its opposite within 5 years? It was the site of the most successful policy of gang social inclusion attempted anywhere. But after the counter-revolution, the very measures that helped Ecuador to be known as the island of peace, i.e. its legalization of street organizations in 2007, instead has become the source of the sweeping invasion of organized groups from the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico to the Albanian mafia. Somehow this brilliant, enlightened policy that did the opposite of mano dura and its variants through empowerment mechanisms, new opportunity structures, cultural supports and anti-defamation laws to prevent moral panics, now features as a major reason behind Latin America's most bloody prison riots in its history, with some 600 inmates slaughtered in an orgy of medieval vengeance just in 2021 and 2022. As one of my field workers just wrote recently, in the last 5 years, neighbourhood, urban, youth organisational structures, be they gangs, armed groups, etc., have undergone important changes in their position and structure in Ecuador. In fact, many have disappeared, and the vast majority have been absorbed by large local and transnational criminal organisations. As the state's control structures in prison and criminal affairs were weakened, while ministries and institutions were reduced and dismantled, large criminal organisations found the opportunity to control drug dealing, human trafficking, prisons and territories in a hegemonic manner. This is the case of urban youth organisations known as gangs in Ecuador, which are absorbed or taken over by local criminal organisations that in turn respond to alliances with transnational criminal organisations or cartels. So this is the leader of a group called the Masters of the Street. His experience, the exact opposite, or actually these are some of the things that John was warning of in 2008, and now it's happened. To understand the global turn in gang development, John turned to Castells, Sasson, Jock Young, Loic Quacon and Mike Davis to inform his analysis, seeing how financialisation and global corporate capitalism was rapidly reconfiguring our built environments, relegating the poor to some amoral rationalisations about economic externalities, allowing the Washington consensus to go about the destruction of welfare state policies and making hyper-repressive paradigms on gangs the default position of so many governments. We need to be constantly reminded that mano dura flows directly from the zero-tolerance logics of New York City. Meanwhile, a network society was leading the marginalized to create cultural communes and resistance identities in the absence of any form of legitimacy for the power structures keeping them behind castle systems of social control. John's work in this area helped us all move away from our parochial vistas and into a world that had not yet been made. And it couldn't be done without the wretched of the earth, which is what the bulk of globalised gang policy is still advocating. I'll finish there. John, on so many levels, mirrored my own trajectory. I come out of a revolutionary political background, and so did John. He was in his 18, 19, I was the same age, 18 to 21, 22. John then went to college. I didn't. I went to the factory, and I didn't start college until I was 25. And then I got into graduate work similar, to John. John started working in something else other than gangs. He's obviously director of the gang intervention here, but then did his dissertation on welfare, and I did my dissertation not on gangs, actually. It was on the sociology of education. And I was working on not why people were dropping out of school, but why would you bother to drop into a school when 50% of your people have dropped out? And the reason was it was about developing a new racial and class identity. And then John got into the gangs and I got into the gangs, and we started to see the literature, completely moribund in terms of what we were looking at. And I turned towards social movements because that was part of my training, and John turned, through Joe Moore, notion of the institutionalization of gangs, which was a very big intervention into the gang field at that time. And then John also moved into the expert witness field, his on death penalties and mine on deportation, which in many respects is another form of death penalty. So along the way, I've learned enormously from John. And, I didn't really know I had much influence on John at all. Mary said that, he mentioned my name a few times around the dining room table, which I had no idea. He was a hero to me. He was a role model, and I miss him tremendously. And we must all kind of pledge to walk in his footsteps where we possibly can. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was so deeply moving, David. I'm sure it took a lot for you to put that together, but wow, what an incredible, profound contribution to our time together today, David. I can't even begin to thank you so much for that. I'm really overwhelmed. On the verge of tears. That was so significant. Not only to talk about our friend, talk about the significance of his work, but what we're up against. I mean, the plight of what we're really up against here. It's so profound, and it's so deep, and it's so significant. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here. This is just so important. One of the things that David alluded to was the importance of how John knew, right? Some of you referred to an epistemological acuity that he had. And I think that's a really important part of who John was. He was an incredible ethnographer. And Lalo, at one point, you said to me, John was just a badass ethnographer. And he represents the best of ethnography and helps keep it elevated as one of our most significant and useful methodological tools to gain a deep understanding of what is happening, and especially what is happening on the ground. John's qualities as a gracious, caring human being carry over into his ethnographic skills. It takes a certain kind of person to do good ethnography. It takes a willingness to build relationships and to understand people from their points of view, while simultaneously building an analytical framework that considers context, structural factors, and dynamics of social and personal interactions. John has passed on that skill and sensitivity to his students. I am very pleased now to present Robert Aspholm, who himself has become an excellent ethnographer and astute observer. Rob is professor at St. Thomas University of Minneapolis and just found out that he got tenure. So yeah. Let's introduce Rob.
Good afternoon, good people. How y'all doing? All right. Good. It's great to be here with you all today to celebrate the life and work of our friend, teacher, mentor, comrade, and brother, John Hagedorn. I want to thank Teresa Cordova and UIC's Great Cities Institute for bringing so many folks who knew and loved John together for this celebration, and to Mary and John's family and everyone else for being here today. I would normally put on a suit for events like this, but the one time I saw John at an academic conference, he was dressed down. And when I kidded him about it, he told me, and I quote, "The only time I wear a suit is when I testify in court, and that's because someone's life is on the line." Now, I'm certainly not saying I'm John, but my choice of attire today was directly inspired by his famous iconoclastic streak. As Dave was referencing, the Hawaiian shirt and gold chain at a previous conference as well. I knew John from my time as a graduate student here at UIC in the Jane Addams College of Social Work. I never had the opportunity to take a course with John, and because we were in different departments, he couldn't be my formal dissertation chair. But my dissertation research on the shattering of African American gangs on Chicago's South Side was very much inspired by John's work, and he played a central role in guiding that research on my dissertation committee and beyond. Indeed, I was introduced to John's early work during my undergraduate studies, so his influence on me began long before my own eventual return to graduate school. And I was fortunate enough to develop a relationship with John that extended far beyond his role as a dissertation committee member into one of broader mentorship and friendship. A couple years ago, I was invited to write a chapter on John's legacy in the field of gang research for the Oxford Handbook of Gangs and Society. This afforded me the opportunity to visit John at his home in Milwaukee to interview him about his life and work. He gave me a guided tour of the city and shared with me its history and how that history intersected with his own experiences as a young man, as an organizer and radical, as a researcher, and as a husband, father, and grandfather. As you all can likely imagine, this was quite an extraordinary experience. What made it even better was that I got to spend this time with John in the service of giving him his own proverbial roses in the form of the chapter I was writing on his life, his work, and his legacy. I worked on that chapter while John was ailing, and I wrote it as a kind of eulogy. I'm so thankful that John got to read the final version of the manuscript before he passed, and that he was deeply touched by it. An abridged form of that chapter will serve as the basis for my talk this afternoon. My goal is to give a high-level overview of John's body of scholarly work, its shifts over the course of some 3.5 decades, and the factors that animated those shifts. In conclusion, I'll situate the substance and trajectory of John's work within the context of his unique approach to social science research, which David also alluded to. Any discussion of John's scholarly work, of course, must begin with his classic first book, 1988's People and Folks, Gangs, Crime, and the Underclass in a Rust Belt City. In his foreword to one of John's later books, Mike Davis lauded People and Folks as an essential guide to clear thinking about street culture and the wages of injustice, and rightly credited the book with founding what might be called critical gang studies. William Julius Wilson called it the most insightful book ever written on inner-city gangs. And Sudhir Venkatesh observed that John's book had revised the gang research agenda almost single-handedly. To date, People and Folks has been cited nearly 1,200 times in the academic literature. A second edition was published in 1998, and it remains in print today. Not bad for a book that started out as a master's thesis and was published at the very beginning of John's doctoral studies. People and Folks emerged out of John's work in community organizing and youth street outreach in Milwaukee. That work was part of roughly 2 decades of civil rights and anti-war activism, labor and community organizing, and political radicalism. John described to me his research with Milwaukee's gangs, whose members and leaders he had befriended and become close with in the course of his work, as an attempt to advance my activism via research. People and Folks documented the collapse of Milwaukee's industrial economy and the impact that collapse had on Latino and especially Black young men. The book was the first study to situate gang dynamics within the context of post-1960s urban deindustrialization and drew heavily on Wilson's research on economic restructuring and concentrated poverty in Black inner-city communities. The shift in Milwaukee street gangs from rudimentary adolescent peer groups to more durable social formations, John argued, had to be understood against the backdrop of skyrocketing joblessness and poverty in the city's dispossessed Black neighborhoods. The gang research of the interwar and post-war decades, insightful as it was, could not adequately speak to the dire circumstances taking shape in America's post-industrial urban core. Through a series of collaborative projects with his mentor, Joan Moore, from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, John continued to carry out research with Milwaukee gang members over the ensuing decade. It was a good thing he did because the first edition of People and Folks was written in the mid-1980s, just before the crack cocaine trade exploded in Milwaukee, as in cities across the country. John's subsequent research examined the evolution of the drug economy among Milwaukee's gangs, documenting how jobless gang members turned to drug trafficking in staggering numbers, and how gang organizational forms and surging levels of gun violence were increasingly shaped by such economic enterprising. This research led John to question and ultimately abandon the underclass framing that defined People and Folks. On one hand, the young men and women who found work in Milwaukee's drug trade were clearly victims of the economic restructuring that Wilson described in his account of the urban underclass, and which John had adapted for People and Folks. On the other hand, however, John was increasingly critical of underclass discourse, which framed the victims of deindustrialization and welfare state retrenchment as somehow fundamentally different from the broader American citizenry. In contrast, John's research in Milwaukee demonstrated that, despite the remarkable explosion of the crack cocaine economy, most gang members retained a rather conventional moral compass and remained committed to the pursuit of conventional employment. Indeed, in a context of near ubiquitous joblessness, John pointed out that drug dealing might be interpreted not as a rejection of conventional values, but as an expression of values such as hard work, entrepreneurialism, and financial success within a severely constricted opportunity structure. In a move almost unheard of in academia, John had seriously critiqued his own prior research findings based on new investigation and analysis. This practice will become a trademark of John's 30-plus year academic career. As the grants for his Milwaukee-based research were winding down, John took a faculty job in the criminology department here at UIC and began more than 2 decades of commuting down from Milwaukee to Chicago. In the midst of all this, John had managed to finish a master's degree in sociology, begin and complete a doctoral program in urban studies, and accept a high-level job in Milwaukee County's Department of Health and Human Services, a job that he lost after 3 years of constant agitation for democratic reforms to the county's child welfare system. For his part, John was surprised that it took that long. I had earned the hatred of the entire bureaucracy, he told me, with not a small measure of pride. No one who knew John would be surprised by such a turn of events, nor by his defiance in recollecting that turn some 3 decades later. Oh, and he published another book based on his work with Milwaukee County, titled Forsaking Our Children, Bureaucracy and Reform in the Child Welfare System. All this in the span of 8 years, no less. But back to Chicago. John told me that he knew it would be difficult, if not impossible, to replicate the work he had done in Milwaukee, which had grown out of a couple of decades of organizing and activism and direct engagement with youthful gang members through such endeavors. Far from hampering John's research program, however, these new practical realities pushed him into new analytic territory as he deepened his historical focus and broadened his political economic analysis. The first of these pursuits was sparked by John's work with Bobby Gore and other vice lord leaders to document the remarkable transformation of the conservative vice lords during the late 1960s and early 1970s, from among Chicago's most infamous street gangs to a successful pro-social community organization. John learned that Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley, the former president of the Hamburgs, a notoriously racist Irish gang, had declared war on gangs in 1969 and had Gore, the most progressive gang leader in the city, railroaded for murder. How could gang involvement lead to the halls of municipal power for Daley and his Hamburg friends and to prison and death for Gore and his vice lord comrades? John found his answers by excavating Chicago's sordid history of racism and corruption and the intimate partnership between the city's democratic political machine, its white ethnic gangs, and the outfit, its organized crime syndicate. John's conclusions led him to fully abandon all adherence to the Chicago School of Sociology's ecological framework, of which Wilson's underclass theory was one version and which had long dominated sociological and criminological theory. The Chicago School approached urban life as an organic process shaped by ostensibly natural dynamics of development and reproduction that pattern neighborhood conditions and that in turn explain patterns of human behavior. Yet John pointed out that the elegant models of urban development postulated by the Chicago School were completely contradicted by the persistent ghettoization of Black Americans. And nothing seemed more unnatural than the contrast between the Hamburg gang's historic ascent to political dominance and the vice lord's descent into despair and drug trafficking. At the same time, the scope of John's work was quickly spreading from the ghettos of the Midwestern Rust Belt to the slums of the developing world. As early as 2001, his work was beginning to grapple with issues of gangs, violence, and inequality on a global scale, and he was traveling and making connections via courses, conferences, and research initiatives the world over, from Belfast and Glasgow to Mombasa and Pretoria to Rio de Janeiro. Indeed, the counterpart to the urban deindustrialization whose effects John had documented in the United States was the rapid industrialization of the global South, as outsourced jobs re-emerged in severely impoverished forms in the metropolises of the developing world, spurring unprecedented urbanization and slum proliferation. Similarly, the near wholesale demolition of public housing in Chicago, which John found to be a key variable in understanding gang organization and patterns of violence, was best understood against the broader reemergence of cities as essential nodes of global capitalism and related efforts to render those cities safe for business via displacement and redevelopment projects. John's research on gangs, race, history, and globalization culminated in his 2008 tour de force, A World of Gangs, Armed Young Men and Gangster Culture, arguably John's most thoroughgoing critique of conventional criminology and his most expansive articulation of an empirical and theoretical alternative. The proliferation of prisons, the underground drug economy, and defensible spaces in urban slums, John argued, were creating institutionalized gangs in dispossessed urban districts the world over, particularly in those locales inhabited by denigrated racial and ethnic groups. In short, what he was documenting playing out on the streets of Milwaukee and Chicago was linked to much further reaching processes set in motion by global capitalism and the rollback of state regulation and provision that has accompanied its spread. Street gangs and urban gun violence in the 21st century, John persuasively argued, could not be understood outside of this broader context. John's dive into Chicago's history had familiarized him with the intricacies of the city's street gangs and ethnic communities, the democratic machine, and the outfit. Though A World of Gangs had made the persuasive case that distinctions between armed groups operating outside the law were not always neat, John's research has consistently demonstrated that, despite much media hype and bluster from public officials to the contrary, U.S. street gangs and organized crime were largely distinct phenomena. A chance exchange with a former student and subsequent interviews with Sal Martino, an outfit functionary, however, illuminated new dimensions of Chicago's storied history of gangs and organized crime, and again changed John's perspective. Most gang kids have always been desperate youth, and most of their gangs are indeed disorganized crime. But not all, John wrote in the introduction to The Insane Chicago Way, the daring plan by Chicago gangs to create a Spanish mafia. This book is the history of the puppeteers, not the puppets, he wrote. The Insane Chicago Way recounts the history of Spanish growth and development, or SGD, a coalition of Latino gangs whose leaders attempted and failed to form a commission-style syndicate to organize crime and regulate violence during the 1990s. Through Martino and the C-Notes, one of the few remaining mostly white gangs in Chicago and an outfit minor league team at the time, the outfit discreetly encouraged the development of SGD, aiming to claim a piece of the action. But gang leaders and mafiosos weren't the only ones on the take, as the Insane Chicago Way explores the political and police corruption that both made the criminal ventures of these groups possible and to undermine the delicate alliances within SGD via robberies, ripoffs, betrayals, and romantic entanglements. John convincingly argues that researchers must recognize that the institutions of social control with which gangs interact are as capable of fueling problems of crime and violence as mitigating them. Turning from police and politicos, the final chapter of John's career saw him set his analytic sights on another institution of social control, the courts, to explore how stereotypes about gang members compromise the administration of justice. John's scholarly motto was research, not stereotypes, and he exemplified that motto in his scholarship. But he also spent nearly a quarter century combating stereotypes in courtrooms across the country. It was a natural step from combating the law enforcement frame academically to combating it in the courtroom, from theory to practice, John explained to me. His final book, Gangs on Trial, Challenging Stereotypes and Demonization in the Courts, weaves together compelling stories from court cases, sociological and psychological analysis, and autobiographical vignettes from his own life in exploring how prosecutors wield demonizing stereotypes about gang members to short-circuit a careful consideration of the facts of apparently gang-related cases. The intentional mischaracterization of gang members as a monstrous other, John argues, constitutes a grave miscarriage of justice, both within the context of individual court cases, as well as societally, as such vilification helps provide ideological justification for our policies of mass incarceration. That provides a pretty solid summary of most of John's major works, although in the interest of time, I had to omit discussion of a couple dozen articles and book chapters, as well as his 2 edited volumes, 2007's Gangs in the Global City and 1999's Female Gangs in America, which he co-edited with Meta Chesney Lind, and which remains the only edited volume on female gangs in the U.S. In light of John's sweeping corpus, how might we best make sense of his extraordinary contributions to gang research and to social science more broadly? Perhaps more than any one other single quality, John's work is most notable as a model for grounded, critical, inductive research. It was his unwavering commitment to this approach that allowed him to produce a canon with a thematic scope unrivaled in the field, as he was unafraid to follow where the facts led him. But what this also necessitated was a true openness to questioning and revising his own empirical findings and conclusions. Indeed, within a half dozen years of publishing People and Folks, John had rejected the undercurrents of that book's underclass framing, arguing that gang members were not adherents to a distinct subculture, but human beings like anyone else doing their best to survive under desperate circumstances. In the preface to the second edition of People and Folks, moreover, John urged readers not to mistake the passion of my arguments for hubris. Like all social science truths, my conclusions must be seen as tentative, not universal, as dynamic, not static, and as firmly rooted in a specific time and place. He continued to follow his own counsel. A decade later, he wrote that his idea for a world of gangs began with my dissatisfaction with the way social sciences, including my own earlier book, People and Folks, had framed gangs. In grappling with the troubling and violent history of the pursuit of power among gang leaders in the insane Chicago way, John wrote in the book's introduction that this book complicates my mission but does not change it. These reflections were no mere lip service, as each major phase of John's career was marked by the emergence of new findings that deepened, complicated, and at times even contradicted what he had previously found. John's approach to research requires, a radical form of honesty and a commitment to values rarely found in academia or outside of it. It requires the capacity to interrogate and make sense of new information with an open mind and a critical spirit. It requires subjecting one's own work to the same thoroughgoing critiques to which one subjects the work of others. It also requires a fearlessness in confronting difficult questions and inconvenient truths that challenge our assumptions and what we think we know about the world. It's worth noting here that the lead editor of the book for which I was invited to write the chapter on John's legacy is someone with whom John shared basically no common scholarly, ideological, or political ground. Dave alluded to some others in his talk as well. In other words, John's work was of such a high caliber that even those with whom he fiercely disagreed and who he'd critiqued had to respect it. It's these commitments and the way John carried them out in his life and work that I consider to be his greatest legacy. John's work serves not only as a blueprint for how to approach research, but as a blueprint for how to approach life. He set an amazing example for all of us. It's now on us to carry that example forward in our own lives and work. I firmly believe we'll be up to the task. After all, we've got John in our corner. Thank you.
Again, I want to remind us that family members are here. We're so happy, Mary, that you are here. Really appreciate it, and the other family members are here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. His sons, daughters, right. Really important. Paul. Also, two very, very close friends of John's are also here. Ivory and Sonny are here. Sonny, and is Ivory still here? Really appreciate it. And then I wanted to also, just another person from the Great Cities Institute staff. We have a very esteemed member who's part of our team, senior fellow at Great Cities, also co-host of Democracy Now! Juan Gonzalez is also with us. I'm sure he didn't want me pointing him out, but anyway, we're very happy that he's part of our team as well. You know, it's been said many times now already about John's focus on economic restructuring and the plight of communities devastated by deindustrialization still unfortunately rings true. In 1998, referring to the devastating impacts of economic restructuring, John said in the second edition of People and Folks that history will judge current American policy harshly, and that left to our current course, we are sure to witness desperate acts of violence and rebellion. And here we are, witnessing both the failure of urban and economic policies along with the desperate acts of violence and rebellion. The kinds of things I think that you alluded to, Rob, in what he predicted, and you, David, as well. And here John was in his work decades later, still engaged in the struggle to point policymakers in the direction of creating opportunities and rebuilding communities, and against scapegoating and demonizing individuals and gangs. The focus, he argued, is on building stability and hope. John was always bringing people together, and he brought us together here today. In May 2018, John brought several of us, including Rob and Andy Papachristos, who was here, I'm not sure if he's still here, from Northwestern University, to counter the narratives around crime, violence, and gangs. We produced a report that we released in January 2019. Another key individual in this collaboration was Lance Williams from Northeastern University here in Chicago. I have had the pleasure of many conversations with Lance since then, and I am so happy that he is here today to talk about John's work and influence on him. Lance, you can either stay there or you can come up here. I don't know if you want to go down and come around, probably be easiest. I love my conversations with Lance, and I'm just so glad that he is here to join us.
Thank you very much. Hey, everybody. I'm going to invoke John's spirit. Now, look, John was a white dude with swag, right? And as I was thinking about, like, this is how I normally regularly dress, right? And so I'm looking at the picture and I'm like, damn, am I imitating John or is John imitating me? I don't know. But yeah, he's just a cool dude. And the first thing that I want to say, though, I think is super important. I just want to acknowledge and just pay homage to Mary and the family on behalf of all of us, his students, his mentees, his clients, colleagues, comrades who spent endless nights and weekends calling him. I know it probably drove you guys crazy with all of the calls that he received. But I just want to thank you for sharing him with us, all of us, and I would just encourage all of us who had these late night talks, long talks with John, especially in the evening during family time on a weekend, to stand up and just give the family a big round of applause. Thank you for sharing him with us. We salute you. Thank you so much. So just real quick, I met John back in 06, 07, around 06, 07, as a doctoral student here at UIC, but I was on the west side of campus, not in the criminology studies department that John was in. And I met him, although I was doing work, my dissertation work was around street youth organizations, youth culture. I didn't meet him directly in that work. The way I met him was because at the time, John was working with the vice lords on the west side. He's working with Bobby Gore, Sonny, Ivory, Chuck Spruill, all of those guys, right? And my father was a 14th Street Clover from North Lawndale. And a lot of those guys ended up becoming vice lords. And so my father, in conversations with Bobby Gore, and I'm sure you know who Bobby Gore is, because John talked about him a lot and was really close with Bobby, who's made his transition. My father and Bobby grew up together. They were really good friends as childhood friends. And so I guess Bobby used to talk to my father about this white dude that's at UIC who's doing research. And, so my father would ask me about him. He's like, this white boy over at UIC is working with Bobby and them. I was like, no, Dad, I don't know who he is. He said, man, I want you to check him out, man, and see what he's about. These white dudes, man, I told Bobby, man, don't be telling him all our secrets, right? So I want you to go check him out. So my father sent me on a mission to go find John Hagedorn. I looked him up, emailed him, and we set a meeting, and I came over in this small little office at the time, and we immediately connected. And, I told my pa, hey, this is a good dude right here. Because John was really big on giving voice to the voices. That's like, that's what I think differentiated him from the average scholar. It was important that he used his platform, he used his power to empower those who couldn't and didn't have the opportunity to speak for themselves, right? So if you read his work, you notice that what he's doing is he's allowing others to speak through him, right? Particularly those who are disenfranchised, those who are marginalized. So I really, that's what I really remember about him most. But then also as a individual trying to find his way, myself, through the academy, needing guidance and help and mentorship, and John was always there for me. And, John's looking for allies, I'm looking for allies in this space that was unfriendly to him as well, right? And so I asked John when I was approaching my dissertation, work and trying to formulate a committee, and I'm like, hey, John, man, you think you could sit on my committee? He's like, well, do you want to graduate? I said, hell yeah, I want to graduate. He said, well, then you don't want to put me on your committee. He said, because those people over where you are hating me. John was constantly into it with people who were kind of too academic. John was a down-to-earth kind of guy, and so he would get into these big fights with people who didn't represent the interests of the folks in the community. And so he said, yeah, man, you put me on your committee, those people that you have over there working with you, you probably will never graduate. And I took his advice and found someone else, and ended up graduating. But we stayed tight the whole time until he made his transition, and it was really opportunities after opportunity after opportunity that he would give me. I know one of the first things that he did, because of I'd done a lot of work and had a lot of access to the history of street organizations. He really encouraged me to write a lot of this work. But one of the things that he did was he invited me into this expert witness testimony space that he was occupying as one of the leading gang experts around the country. And so one of the first cases that he brought me on was a big case down in Miami. It was a case with the Liberty City 7. I'm sure you've read about some of his work on that particular case. So he brought me down to work on that case. It was a kind of Blackstone case, and it was. I thought, wow, this is crazy. Getting invited down to Miami, to hang out with John for some days and work on this case. It was, just being in Miami is just a whole nother vibe, right? So I thought, this would be my expert witness kind of trajectory, and I could get with this, man, flying down to Miami. But come to find out, that was about almost 12 years ago. I haven't been back to Miami since. And so most of these cases are in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, in a hole in the ground someplace, and someplace that no one wants to go, but it's the work that we're committed to in this opportunity that we have. And so I want to just thank him for inviting me into the space. I was just talking to Ivory earlier about a case that I have of some vice lords up in Detroit. And so it's kind of like you guys now kind of have to, as you work with John, you got to help me too as you help John get through this stuff, because all of it is about representing the interests of the people and people with the lived experience, helping them to speak for themselves in this work. So I want to end with that, just to say that it's been a great opportunity to work with him and continue to, get guidance from him. Gangs on Trial is kind of like my blueprint for the work that I'm doing in expert witness testimony. He left this for us in a lot of his other works to kind of continue, give us marching orders and continue the work that he's already started. I want to thank you, Teresa, for inviting me to speak. It was a great opportunity. And I want to thank everyone for being here. And, we just continue to work with John. And I think, we're going to make this place a much better place for all of us, particularly young African-American males and Latino males that are caught up, and women that are caught in these systems. But if we can follow the blueprint that John laid for us, I think we're going to make some progress, and we'll be able to help a lot of people who need the help. Thank you so very much.
So all this talk about how John dressed and stuff. When I was putting my suit on this morning, I was like, why are you wearing this suit? John never wore a suit. It's like, so well, okay, I was already halfway dressed, so I'm just gonna wear my suit anyway, right? Thank you, Lance, I really, really appreciate it. Dear friends of John traveled from very far to be here. And the one who traveled the furthest came all the way from Scotland, from Glasgow, Scotland. You've heard references to the global cities study and some of the work that John did internationally and some of the comparative work. Well, one of the people that he met through that work is Alistair Fraser. And so, Alistair, if you want to come up next, sure, or you can sit there, whichever you choose. Yeah, come on up. Yeah.
Dr. Hagedorn, I presume. These were the words I spoke when I first met John back in 2009. It was autumn, and the trees on this campus were starting to turn gold. I had travelled then, as I did yesterday, some 15 years later, from Glasgow to Chicago, then a wet-behind-the-ears PhD student from a small town in Scotland. I had read everything that John had written and was slightly in awe. My opening words were meant to be kind of funny, but they were immediately lost in the tumult of John's office. He was sitting beside his desk, books and paper everywhere, engaged in passionate discussion with a student. With his shirt unbuttoned, playing with his pendant on his necklace, he moved and spoke like quicksilver. He stopped the conversation dead and beckoned me in. "Alistair, come and tell us what you think." Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. I can't tell you how much it means to me to be here standing before you today to celebrate the life and work of the one and only John Hagedorn. When I heard about John's death, I was far away from anyone who knew him, and it felt kind of lonely. I first went to his writing and the work we'd done together, but it wasn't enough. There's no substitute for being amongst people who know him well and loved him best, and this is why it's such an honour to be here today, and thank you, Teresa, for the opportunity to be here. I don't know if anyone will know them, but I wanted to just reflect on these 4 books published by the Scottish writer Ali Smith, all published in the last couple of years. They were written quickly during the tumultuous years of Brexit and COVID-19 and capture a zeitgeist in much of the way I think that John did with his writing, acting as a kind of lightning rod for the issues of the day. As I talk about some of my memories of John through autumn, winter, spring and summer, I just wanted to share a few of these with you. That's the thing about things, Ali Smith says. They fall apart. Always have, always will. It's in their nature. You all call autumn fall here in the States, and I can see why. I have a vivid memory of walking around the block in my building when I lived in Chicago, trying to catch the burnt orange leaves as they fell from the tree. I never quite managed. I'd been studying youth gangs in Glasgow for a few years and thought I'd figured out some kind of similarities between Glasgow and Chicago. Both are former second cities, the who'd led parallel lives of industry and urbanisation, both with a macho, violent image. Chicago, the city of broad shoulders, the city on the make. Glasgow, the dear green place, the friendly, violent city, where, as the comedian Kevin Bridges has quipped, someone will stab you and then give you directions to the hospital. John welcomed me into his office and welcomed me into his orbit and brought me into his force field. He took me around his Chicago, he met his people, we met former gang leaders, community organisers, politicians. We hung out in alternative schools, back streets, seminar rooms. I took all his classes and asked question after question. Thinking back now, this was one of the most profound experiences of my life. By the end, I felt completely changed. The reality of Chicago was a world away from what I knew. In Glasgow, the boys I worked with were on a different level altogether. They had scars from fighting and knife attacks, but mostly their gang was about being attached to a local area rather than what John has called the institutionalised gangs in Chicago. Under his guidance, my carefully constructed theory of gangs came falling down like leaves from a tree. I know John was fond of poetry. I remember him telling me he liked to quote Tennyson, "The old order changeth, yielding forth the new." And I know he used to say this to people involved in street life, but when Rob was speaking there, I was also thinking about his work and also the legacy that you're carrying on, Rob. But the poetry that I think speaks most clearly to my time in Chicago was that of T.S. Eliot in Little Gidding, where he says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Winter. That's one of the things stories and books can do. They can make more than one time possible at once. The following winter, John travelled to Scotland. We were trying to develop a new method of comparison that we called a global exchange, where ethnographers exchange field sites, with the other acting as a critical friend and gatekeeper. It was meant as a corrective and a challenge to the so-called Eurogang method, which starts from a narrow presumption of similarity. We were after the bottom-up rather than the top-down. It was the coldest winter in years. The newspapers called it the beast from the east. The streets were frozen solid, trains cancelled, cars stuck on the motorways amid the snow. Yet we soldiered on, John in his fleece-lined hat and thick coat. He went everywhere and met everyone with his characteristic humour and curiosity. He visited youth projects, went to a wedding, made an appearance on a community radio station. He even visited my hometown and met my parents. At the time, my mum was working as a bereavement social worker on a programme called Seasons for Life, which I wonder is maybe an inspiration for this. She loved meeting John and wanted me to share this. Although I only met him the once, Ali, when you brought him to the house, I will never forget his larger-than-life personality and his keen interest in everything about the people of Scotland. This was absolutely true. John studied the history of Scotland, its culture and its people, with passion and determination. One day, he acted as an examiner on my PhD defence. It was hours long, and he gave me an absolute pounding. Afterwards, I was standing outside in the freezing cold, smoking a lonely cigarette, wondering what was going to happen next. Less than a minute later, the convener came out and told me to stub it out. The committee have made their decision. On re-entering the room with a degree of trepidation, I saw John sitting with a huge grin on his face. I'd passed with no corrections, but he wanted to make me feel like I'd earned it, hence the pounding. After that, we did a typically Scottish thing of opening a bottle of whiskey and throwing the cap out the window, so you have to finish it in one sitting. On another day, he gave a keynote lecture at a big conference we'd organised. He was on typically charismatic form, presenting on material from A World of Gangs that we've heard about already. But afterwards, when I went to give him a bear hug, he winced in pain. He confessed that he'd actually fallen in the snow one of the first days after arriving in Scotland and had banged himself up pretty badly. My colleague Michelle bundled him straight into a taxi to the emergency room, where they discovered he'd actually cracked several ribs, and he'd spent the last week in Scotland with cracked ribs. The thought of him shouldering his way through the Glasgow snow, braving it through the pain, is one that's poignant and now frozen in time. But stories like this, as Ali Smith says, can make more than one time possible at once. In sharing memories of John here today, we can similarly make more than one time possible at once and make him alive in our present. After his return to Chicago, he wrote me this note. Glasgow, or he would say Glasgow, like Rob did, Glasgow seemed to me a place out of time, more Chicago school than Chicago itself. It appeared so stable. Kids fought for their neighbourhood and told me it wasn't for drugs or money. I could see why you invoked Thrasher, even as I was questioning the old master. I'm not sure I accepted as accurate my 1 month snapshot of Europe's leading gang city, but I surely wasn't in Lawndale anymore. Spring. April. It teaches us everything. The coldest and nastiest days of the year can happen in April. It won't matter. It's April. April Fool's Day, today, also probably marks what was the old end of the New Year celebrations. When I think of John now, I think of spring. Maybe it's that sense of renewal, of eager anticipation for rebirth, of hope, captures something of his spirit. It has not escaped me that today is the 1st of April, a month Ali Smith calls the anarchic, the final month of spring, the great connective. I sort of think John might have liked that. I actually still can't quite believe he's gone. We hadn't seen each other in person for years, but were in regular contact over email. His messages were always generous, thoughtful, kind, but also totally honest, scathing, searingly critical, often uncompromisingly critical. This is perhaps the reason why it took us nearly 7 years to write something about the comparative project we did between Glasgow and Chicago, during which time we each wrote whole books about those two cities separately. I still have the sense, though, that he's at the other end of a keyboard somewhere, waiting to tap in a fiercely funny and savagely critical note about whatever's on his mind. I wrote to him when my dad died, aged 73, in 2021. He replied, "The dark angel of death lurks around all of us, and as I get older, I see her menacing shape congeal out of the mist." He told me that his own father had been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease in 1967 and died 6 months later on Christmas Eve. He continued, "In many ways, I've never got over it. But I also have moved ahead, the grief becoming part of who I am." His words were a comfort, both then and now, to me and maybe others here. Over time, grief does become part of who we are, and we keep people alive by talking about them, remembering them, and honouring them in all their complexity. We were last in touch about this time last year. As he said then, "I'm delighted to welcome another spring. I had always hoped I'd get back to Glasgow and see you again. I'm quite proud to have known you and watched you grow. Don't stop." I nearly wrote back to say we would see each other again, in Glasgow or Chicago, in some parallel universe, reborn as ants in the soil or swifts on the wing. I'm not religious, but my grandfather was a minister and maybe a little rubbed off. I stopped myself then, but I think he'd be pleased to know he brought me back to Chicago one more time. And I know he's here too, somewhere, in the memories shared today, and the fight's still ongoing. Summer. That's summer for you. Summer's like walking down a road just like this one, heading towards both light and dark. Because summer isn't just a merry tale, because there's no merry tale without darkness, and summer's surely really all about an imagined end. I realise, looking back now, that I never got to know John in summer. I know he was fond of a Hawaiian shirt, as we've heard a lot about today, but I never saw him kick back on the beach holding a cocktail in a coconut. In some ways, I'm happy to leave it like that, to imagine him, like Ali Smith says here, walking down a road just like this one, heading towards both light and dark. But I'd be happier still, I think, to hear from some of you, friends old and new, to hear about John in summer and beyond, completing the cycle in the seasons of life, in the knowledge that as we march onward from spring to summer and beyond, we have John as our guide in word and in spirit. Thank you.
Wow, this is so fantastic, isn't it? Thank you so much. Thank you. It's beautiful. One of the things that John would do, he would find ways for his different lives to intersect, and folks that he met through some of his work, he would bring into his classroom, and he would often bring them back to speak in their classes. And Bennett Lee is one such person who often came to John's classes to speak. So with that, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Let me first start off thanking the group that put this together to even think about allowing me to be one of the speakers today. I'm more than honored. But let me first say, I know it's through the grace of a merciful God and a praying mother and a father I know in my heart that didn't give up on me that I'm able to be anywhere today. Dr. John Hagedorn. I first heard that name through Bobby Gore. Dr. Hagedorn had this website, gangresearch.net, where he highlighted the life of Bobby Gore and other articles about the vice lords. And Bobby came to me and he said, this guy, Dr. Hagedorn, highlighted me on his website. And somehow he heard about you, and he wanted to know if you would come and speak to his class. And so, because Bobby referred, I was, okay, cool. And I spoke, and Dr. Hagedorn recorded me. And through that recording, he highlighted me on his website, right? Benny Lee, leader of the Vice Lords from the 60s through the 70s. And that article, even though it was all in my own words, that article kind of put me on the map, so to speak. Because after that article, I started getting calls from Vice Lords from Mississippi, Memphis, Minnesota, somewhere, like I was this hell of a gang leader of the Vice Lord. You know, my tenure with the Vice Lords, I became one of the youngest chief of the Vice Lord Nation in 1967. When I was 13 years old, you know, we were Apache Vice Lords. You know, we lived in a predominant white community, fought whites to go swimming at Columbus Park, to the theaters and all of that. And that forced us to band together to protect ourselves. And you had some older Vice Lords there, the Cicero Vice Lords. And they said if we were going to be in that era, we got to become Vice Lords. Now, we all in the 7th and 8th grade, right? And that's how we became Vice Lords. But Dr. Hagedorn, with that article and highlight me on his website, I started getting invited to speak in other places about my experience being a Vice Lord. But see, that tenure was short-lived because, see, after that, I ended up in IYC St. Charles, a juvenile prison. You know, Martin Luther King had just got assassinated in 1968. And we were like that first largest group of blacks to go to school at Austin High School. And it was a lot of racial tension. And we ran into a lot of racial tension. And a lot of us blacks got suspended. They said I was the ringleader and I was the only one end up in juvenile court. And they asked my parents if they want me to go to school. My parents said yes, but they didn't realize they wanted to send me to St. Charles, Illinois State Training School for Boys, you know, a juvenile prison. And that's how I ended up there. I ended up doing 2 years down there because I ran into some guys from the South Side, thought they was tough, you know, some Disciples and some Blackstone Rangers, because those are South Side gangs, right? They weren't on the West Side, right? And so I remember they wanted to do this documentary on gangland. And they were going around and trying to do this research on the Vice Lords to do this documentary on gangland. And somehow my name kept coming up. And basically through this article that Dr. Hagedorn had on his website. And so when they got to me, I was asking, what did you come up with? They say, well, we know Willie Lord is the founder of the Vice Lords and da-da-da-da. I said, wait a minute. No, that's some misinformation. You know, a guy named Edward Perry, Pepperlo, he's the founder of the Vice Lords, 1957, while he was in St. Charles Youth Commission. And so they started pulling at me, and I said, you need to talk to this guy named Fred D. Gore. We call him Bobby Gore. A lot of people think that's Bobby's real name. That was a nickname after his uncle. He was called Little Bobby, but his name is Fred D. Gore. So I introduced him to Bobby, and they asked him Bobby all this question, pulling at him. I said, look, y'all need to hire him as a consultant on this thing. And so they hired Bobby as a consultant. Then they kept pulling at me with information that Bobby didn't have. I said, well, y'all need to hire me as a consultant, right? So we kind of control the narrative of gangland, Lords of the Holy City. And I was in grad school, right? And some of the professors at Northeastern would ask me to come speak to their class, to share my personal experience. You know, if I spent time on death row, spent 3 years on death row because of my gang affiliation in prison, right? Me and 16 other brothers charged with 15 counts of murder, 2 attempted murder, mob action. And it was a big case, big death penalty case, right? And so the professor would invite me to speak to their class on my personal experience with the criminal justice system and with gangs. And, you know, our students do these evaluations after each class, and my name kept coming up. And so what happened, I ended up in grad school, and you know you had to do this thesis, this research paper. I said, well, I'm going to do it on the vice lords and show that a street gang with the proper support can become a community organization, which the vice lords was the very first street organization to get incorporated as a non-for-profit organization. Right? First, they frowned on it a little bit, but then after I showed them all the research I'd done, because Bobby had boxes of old newspaper clippings and minutes from meetings and grants they got from Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Company, all them places. And I used all that to put my presentation together, my thesis together, right? And I ended up getting my master's degree because of that research I'd done on the vice lords, right? And with the help of Dr. Hagedorn, helped me structure it and gave me a little few pointers on what I need to do with all that. So I ended up getting my master's degree, and it was right after that I took all these boxes of clippings back to Bobby Gore. I said, man, you know, you got enough stuff here to start a museum. And we laughed about it. And 2 days later, he said, man, you know, I thought about what you said. Maybe we can do that, because I would hate to die and this stuff, this history die with me. So that's when I met with Dr. Hagedorn, and I appealed to him what me and Bobby talked about. And he said, that's a great idea. So he introduced me to Lisa Lee, who was the director at the time over the Jane Allen Hull House Museum right next door here. And so she was enthused about it, and she introduced me to Lisa Junkins. And Lisa and I, we ciphered through all this stuff and began to call people from 16th Street, Lawndale, that was old enough to recognize who was on those pictures and all that stuff. And out of that, we put that exhibit together. It's called a report, The Untold Story of the Conservative Vice Lords, Report to the Public. And that museum in 2004 won the most outstanding historical exhibit award in 2014. So it gave Vice Lords history some credibility, right? But Dr. Hagedorn has always been my go-to person, right? He gave me a different perspective how to address these issues around street gangs. I learned from him terminology like social disorganization, honor me, right? Social control. I never heard of that stuff, but through him, he helped frame the work I was doing. And I don't know if it had any influence on Lance, Dr. Lance, but Dr. Lance was the assistant director at Northeastern Inner City Studies at the time. And he approached me and said, hey, man, we got a vacant class at the Center for Inner Studies on the history of Chicago street gangs. You think you'd be willing to teach that class? I said, yeah. I ain't never taught in my life. I said, yeah, I think I can. But he trusted me, him and Dr. Conrad World, and they hired me as an adjunct professor at Northeastern Illinois University in the Justice Studies Department. And I've been teaching that class now for maybe about 11, 12 years now. And then I got moved up and teach on theories of criminal behavior, introductions to the criminal justice system. Now I teach at a graduate level in social work, a class on social work and political activism. And a lot of my concepts, a lot of my understanding come from reading a lot of the works of Dr. Hagedorn. He had a great influence on me framing a lot of what I knew and what I wanted to do. So I'm very grateful to him, you know, and I was really saddened when I heard he was sick. You know, I tried to call him, but I understood. That's why I didn't call him that much, because I know it's a struggle talking, you know, when you're going through some health challenges like that, right? But I prayed for him. You know, then when I heard of his transition, you know, I was saddened by that. But I knew I wanted to be here, you know, to share my respects and my condolences to his family and to those of you that he impacted your lives, because he surely impacted mine. And, you know, it's an African proverb that say, even the best dancer know when it's time to exit the stage. And so now I know it's time for me to get off this stage I've been on, for not this stage, but the stage I've been on, because there's another stage waiting on me. There's a lot of books inside of me, that I need to produce, I need to write. And it was Dr. Hagedorn that told me after I did that first interview, he said, your story is a book, it's an autobiography, you need to write it. He said, you wouldn't be who you are today if you hadn't read Malcolm X's autobiography. Some young person needs to read your story and be inspired like Malcolm X inspired you. So that's what I leave with Dr. Hagedorn. He inspired me now to get off this stage and what I'm doing and start the writing. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, first of all, for all of you. Before I forget, I know my staff Ebing will be like, don't forget to remind them. We have opened up an account for, in John's honor, and we hope with that we'll be able to do then our annual lecture series, I think, Rob, that you were suggesting that we do, and some other things in honor of John Hagedorn. So if you can't do it today, be sure and take these with you. This is a link to donate to the fund that we've established for John. You've heard now a lot of mention about John's students, and I mentioned to you that we had done this conference back in 2016 on Latino gang research. Oh, hi, Lisa. I just recognized, just saw you here. Lisa, I mentioned that Dr. Ritchie is here, and Lisa also from Criminology, Law and Justice is here. So thank you both very much. And I mentioned earlier also that they were doing an event to honor John on April 18th as part of their annual alumni event. So they'll be honoring John at that. But you know, I mentioned that we had done this event on Latino gang research, and Lalo, you came to that, and John really wanted to honor his mentor, which was Joan Moore. He had great love for her, really, really deep love for her, I think, as we know, right? And so he wanted to do this event to honor her. We were able to do that before she passed, and it was really a wonderful event. And at that event, we had her first student, which is Diego Vigil, and then we had also her last student, I guess, at that event, which was Alice. And so at this event, I'm not sure who was John's first student, but we know who his last student was, and it was Caitlin Devaney, and he adored her. So Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Well, hello. Thanks, Teresa. You started off and make me cry already. A lot of what I prepared for today has already been said, so I'm going to delete a little bit of my talk. I really wanted to highlight John as an ethnographic researcher. And we know all of the work, we talked all day about all of his work, but I'll start off with how I became his student. I met him when I was a young master's student here at UIC, and I, growing up, struggled. I'm really empathetic, but also am very aware of dynamics around me that upset me. And I grew up in a house where we didn't talk about those things. So I went to sports for that. So I learned when there's a lot of issues going on around me, injustice, things that don't sit right, I didn't have the emotional ability to talk about it, so I played sports. And I ended up getting a scholarship for basketball, and I don't think of it as I was naturally athletic. I just was very upset all the time. So I made it through college, and I played basketball, so I still had that outlet. So when I met John, I was a master's student, and we were sitting in his class, and I didn't know much about him. And I learned quickly that I needed some other way, as things were happening around me that were bothering me, to calm myself down. So I hadn't had a lot of time to figure this out, but I learned Sudoku would work. So I would go into class, and I would already have these puzzles written out on my notepad. So if there's something going on around me, or a student says something that I don't like, I can just focus on my notepad, and I can solve numbers. And there was one, it was early in his class, I forget, it was his gangs class for PhD and master's students. And I remember I had this look on my face, and I immediately looked down and I started doing my puzzle. There was something going on around me in class, a topic that just immediately looked down at my puzzle, and he's paying attention to me. And after class, he pulls me over, and he notices it. And we start talking about it, and I kind of forget what the topic was in class. But here, he introduced me, one, to this idea of a PhD. It was not on my radar. I frankly didn't even really know what it meant. And he also introduced me to ethnographic research in that moment. He introduced the field note. So where there was Sudoku, where there was sports for me, I now could put them in words, in writing, and produce a field note. So when I think of him as my mentor and as somebody who really ethnography was part of his life, that was the first piece of that. So John really understood the importance of responsible ethnographic research, particularly in understanding the dynamics of gangs and their impact on communities. So everybody has talked about his multiple pieces of work that have taken him all over the world. But I came into my PhD with a particular research interest, but also an accompanying fear of that research. So I'm a white researcher, and I was looking to study non-white spaces. And when I say that I have all these feelings and dynamics going on inside of me, that was a really strong piece of fear. And I mentioned that to him. And he said, you are ethical and you're opinionated, and that's the researcher I want to start off with. He didn't look for skill set. He didn't look for a background. He looked for human dynamics and said, I'll teach you the rest. And I entered my PhD feeling strong. The fear never went away, but feeling strong and knowing that he would be my mentor through it. He taught me the importance of field notes that are still part of my everyday. So, in criminology, we take on traumatic work. I went from studying homicide to doing prison research. So he would call and check in on me, and I'd be on my way back from a prison, and I, in true Caitlin fashion, would be crying. Like, I would go from having a high of this is great work to hitting the car ride home and just crying nonstop. And he introduced me, like I said, to this idea of write that in a field note. Not only are the dynamics you're experiencing in these spaces important, but also so are your feelings, what's coming up for you. And it's something that I think when you are an ethnographer, that it doesn't just leave as you enter a space. And he's taught me that as part of my way of dealing with spaces in my own research, but also dealing with the trauma that comes from that particular work. As I prepped the academic stuff for this talk that I'm completely deleting, but one of the pieces that goes along with responsible ethnographic work is building trust and rapport. And there are a bunch of dynamics of responsible ethnographic work that I teach my students, but that is the one that when I think of John the most, I think about that. He emphasized building genuine relationships, particularly in his work in understanding perspectives of gang members. I think a lot of what I read now is kind of a watering down of people who label themselves as ethnographers, people who label themselves participant observation or this type of work where they are fully engaged in an environment. John really, to me, was not just a researcher. It wasn't something that leaves the space. I have a quote here. I looked at the definition of participant observation research, and I quote, it says, with the sole purpose of which is to achieve an understanding of local knowledge, values, and practices from the native's point of view. To me, that doesn't encompass what John did, as it wasn't his sole purpose. As he was pretty vocal to me about him getting to the point where he knew he was passing on and passing on quickly, he gave me a list of people who are important to him, and many of them are here today. And I've had so many emails from people who say, I don't know you, but John said he trusted you. And I want to continue on my work with John with you. I don't think of myself as a gang researcher, but when you think about John's work, it didn't just end with death. He passed on his important relationships. This idea of it being a sole purpose of entering a space to produce knowledge, it's not John. His relationships didn't even end in death. His friends, this idea of subjects, this idea of access and research, his subjects are here. They are now people who I talk to regularly, and I think it really, really encompasses John and his work. Again, I was going to go through his work of contextual understanding, his work of challenging stereotypes, policy implications, but I think many of you have already done that. I put this at the end because I told you I'm emotional, so this is the end. This is what he sent me as his last field note. This is from September 4th, 2022. And his email the subject was my last field note, and the topic was my last case, deja vu all over again. And it's about the court case of Rodney Robbins in Milwaukee. In it, he writes, "I'm finished with cases. I am both not healthy enough to take on another case, but also have lost hope. I don't want to tell defendants that there is a chance of winning or even a reasonable sentence." Then later on, he says, "If I was younger, I'd keep fighting. The dehumanization and cruelty of the criminal justice systems needs to be opposed, win or lose. But now I am neither young nor in good health. The last case has crushed my spirit. I choose not to be an actor in an elaborate performance of pretending the outcome is the product of a trial. I can't take it anymore." I say that to say, again, in his ethnographic work, we learn it in methodology classes and qualitative methodology. As you enter a space, you have access. These are your subjects. We report a sample size. John's work in his life was much more than a sample size, and he took it to his deathbed. It was something that he wrote in his last field note. I take it as he said he's passing on the torch, but it was meaningful to him, and these were not his subjects. They're his friends, they're his family, and I'm honored to have that passed on to me, and I hope to do nearly as well as John has. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. You notice I didn't give a lot of details on the biographies of the various speakers. You can go to the program. There's you read them when you did your RSVPs, and you can go to the program, and you can also get more details and who these wonderful people are. Before I call up a couple more people up to the stage for us to squeeze them in, John, you also heard reference. I think David, you mentioned that, or maybe it was you. One of you mentioned that Alistair, Rob, I guess it was you who mentioned the only book on female gangs, still the only book on female gangs, was one that John co-edited, along with a colleague who's at the University of Hawaii who could not be here to join us, Metha Chesney Lind. But she did send these words, which I would like to read. "The world lost an incredible gang researcher when John Hagedorn passed away. I missed him terribly during a recent interview I had with two journalists from Vice talking about current trends in gang crime. John's path-breaking research for People and Folks documented the powerful way that race and racism work in the world of gangs, pushing African American youth and reliance on gangs for employment while their white counterparts picked up the last jobs in factories. He also understood the ways in which gender and gangs worked, having studied with Joan Moore and later collaborated with me on one of the only books on female gangs in America. John's expertise on the reality of gangs, as opposed to the racist and demonic stereotypes of gangs, made him a go-to person for youth facing long sentences because the prosecution can count on the public's belief that all youth in gangs are hyper-violent and a threat to public safety. John's passion for social justice is evident in all of his work, and I am very sad that the important projects he had planned were cut short by his passing." That was from Metha Chesney Lind. And I was also asked to pass on saludos and regrets that he couldn't be here today from Diego Vigil, who's a good friend of mine, and Lalo's also was with us at that Latino Gang Researcher Conference, and who's at the, he's at Riverside or Irvine? Lalo, Riverside. Where? Irvine, University of California, Irvine. So saludos from Diego Vigil. I think we're going to have time for those of you maybe who want to say a couple of words towards the end. Sonny, I don't know if you wanted to throw something in the end or not, but we're going to sort of have this last group of speakers, last three speakers, who are students, were students of John's. I think we all continue to be students of John's. And they're going to present some of their thoughts on the ways in which John impacted them and their work. So let me turn it over to you, Javier, and you can introduce the other two folks.
I have the privilege to close out this amazing program today by speaking a little bit on behalf of John and have some students here alongside with me. And we'll share briefly share some of our maybe lasting impact that John had on us. And if one way that John is visible in addition to the works that he's published, he's also visible and lives in the work that we all carry on in his name. So we were supposed to choose a book, right? Choose a book in which had some impact on our work, on our advocacy, and of course, if you're going to talk about John, then it's like a toss-up. We all kind of drawing straws, which one of us is going to win out and talk about people and folks, and I happen to draw the strong one. And I certainly don't want to replicate what's been set up here, but just to, and don't want to belabor the moment, but just to be sort of, to emphasize again for anyone who did not have the opportunity to read that amazing work and its impact. And just to, I would always admire this aspect of John is that he published that while he was still like an MA student. And I remember thinking about how much more advanced he was and how many ways I was just never gonna be like John. I was like, wow, I'm barely just trying to get through these finals, and he had already published a book by this time period. So I was always just in awe of the type of scholar and advocate that somehow was able to be combined in that one person. So first published in 1998, John Hagedorn's, one of his seminal works, People and Folks, was hailed for his ethnographic examination of gangs in society. At the time, it was a departure from the traditional representations of gangs, which were based largely on quantitative research methodologies, or, as he was very critical, from researchers who failed to conduct any qualitative fieldwork. People and Folk introduced the reader to the nuances of growing up in Milwaukee's poor and racialized communities. Hagedorn contextualizes the formation of gangs within the period of deindustrialization, concentrated poverty, unemployment, and social isolation. Specifically, People and Folks examine how the industrialization period impacted African-American communities, who also suffered racial segregation, limited housing opportunities, police abuses, and what would later be called the war on drugs, or the way that we would commonly refer to it, the war on poor people of color. So the importance of this work, and I think about the importance of that book in my lives, was that it really challenged us to consider the structural factors in gang formation in many ways that hadn't been sort of understood at the time period. Much of that, which is sort of common sense phenomenon today, I think we just got to understand in the context that John was really distinguishing himself from other gang scholars of this time period. His work was a call for qualitative research methods in which we got to know our participants. Rather than looking at gang members through the lens of pathology, which was a dominant sort of interpretation during the time period, and maybe in some ways, and regrettably still is today, Hagedorn attempted to humanize his participants and explore their lived experiences. And this is something that really spoke out when I first read that book. Hagedorn's work presents the struggles of real people, not statistical equations found in much of the literature. As I was sort of reviewing some of the book like expertise and critiques of the time period, Ralph Sampson comes up, which, you know, most times I would probably sort of appreciate Ralph Sampson's analysis, but in this case, when talking about my chair, I sort of disagree with what his conclusions were. But Ralph Sampson critiqued his book for a number of things, for not referring to the gang literature of the time period. And I think that's what, again, distinguished John, because maybe the critiques that he received from the book was very much coming from the canon themselves trying to protect its boundaries about what is considered to be academic research. And John just kind of disagreed with that. And rather than wasting his time and wasting the time of the reader to talk about the literature which he grossly sort of opposed, he just kind of ignored them and kind of went off on his way, right, in true John fashion. So it's given the narrow perspective of the academic writing of the time period, it's clearly not surprising that John just went about his business and wrote his book. When I think about the significance of people and folks, I think, again, I want to echo one of the thoughts that were mentioned here, is that John gave voice to the voiceless. One thing I vividly remember being with John, and certainly in the community that I live in, is that John would not be shy about his defense of gangs. And as I sit and kind of reflect on those early meetings that we would have with community leaders, you know, all of my life, for somebody who also participated in street gangs, it was always like the community leaders who always pointed their fingers at us as we were the scourge of the community. And you have this sort of structural society that is sort of discarding you and letting you know that you don't belong. In addition, you also have the community leaders who are supposed to be the advocates of the community and represent the community. And they're the ones who are telling you just the same, that you don't belong. And so I always grew up in this sort of context in which I'm being told that I don't belong from every sort of circle, until along I read this book. And John is really clarifying the fact that I do belong. And so in many ways, I saw John standing up to community leaders. And that was the part I think, I admire John for so many reasons, but this is probably one of the most that I really do admire and miss my dear friend, is that he was an advocate, a staunch advocate for some of the most marginalized voices that you have there. I think it's easy to stand up against, you know, Dom and the police in some ways, against the racism, society against the racism. I thought that he put himself out there particularly alone on an island by standing against community leaders and saying that you were wrong, that it is the young people that you are discarding. And that's where I feel like John in many ways spoke to me, and that's why I feel incredibly lucky that I drew the straw in speaking about this book. Today, I think about the impact that John has had on individuals like me, and as it was mentioned, that somebody needs to read our life stories. I think it's John that gives that voice of growing up in these marginalized communities, growing up in the shadows of urban unrest of the 60s and the 70s, and really just being discarded. And John was that voice in our ears, just kind of telling us that we belong. So I think I have plenty more stories to tell, maybe over a drink at a pub later on. But I certainly want to thank you for your time. I'm going to introduce now Iris Rivera in here. Let me just make sure I have her bio. Okay. So Iris Rivera is a 24-year career at the Cook County Juvenile Probation Officer. She's a former student of Hagedorn. She's currently the Director of Compliance at Cook County Juvenile's Temporary Detention Center. She began her studies with John Hagedorn in the early 2000s, but left to focus on raising her son, who is also a graduate of UIC. She returned to the program 2 years ago with the support of John Hagedorn. I defer the floor now to Iris Rivera.
Losing a beloved professor is a poignant experience. And finding the right words to honor him is challenging for all of us, because he was adored by so many. He left a lasting impact on countless students, colleagues, and community members. I shared a deep passion for learning from Dr. Hagedorn in his class in the early 2000s. I had never heard a professor center education and research as a tool for fighting oppression and promoting social change through a dialogue of collective action. He believed in bringing truth to power by ensuring that research is done with people rather than on them or for them. When I was a graduate student in his class, he made me feel like what I had to say was valuable. One day, as we decided to embark on an independent study together, he said, "Did you pick up my latest book?" At that time, it was A World of Gangs, Armed Men and Gangster Culture. He said, "I quoted you in my book. So I want to read what I said, because I couldn't remember what I said at the time. And we had been going back and forth about talking about my thesis on social identity, girls, and hip-hop culture from detention to community. Every time I left his office, I kept thinking I needed to change my thesis because he had me thinking about gangster rap and girls and gangs. But I stood firm in what I wanted to research. And sometimes I thought he wasn't listening. But he showed me otherwise. On page 103, this is the book I chose. Female rappers, as well as males, turn to religion, ethnic and racialized identities to resist urban conditions and mainstream culture. Quite naturally, females as well as males feel pride in their religion, race, ethnic group. However, the sexism of men complicates female identity. My student, Iris Rivera, a Puerto Rican graduate student doing her thesis on female identity and hip-hop, says of her own experience, and so he quotes me. As an adolescent, I listened to the old school style of hip-hop, and during the early 90s, I was immersed in the new school culture, oftentimes buying and listening to misogynist music because of its ethnic beat and my identification with lyrics that denounced police brutality, systemic racism, and promoted the plight of the ghetto blues. Rivera captures the contradiction between self-respect as a woman and the need to identify with her own oppressed group. He goes on to talk about Milwaukee gang girls loving to fight, rejecting traditional female roles, asserting their independence from men who saw them only as pillow queens. I asked in our next meeting, I wrote that? He said, yes, you did. He listened with compassion and empathy. He sought justice and equality in everything he did and produced knowledge for social change in his entire life. I'm honored that he has shaped my life to pursue a doctorate for meaningful change. I may not be his first student, and I'm not his last student, but I am his oldest returning student. I'm 52. Dr. Hagedorn was gracious with his time. He ignited curiosity in me and saw potential when others were uncertain. So I want to say, rest well, dear professor. You will forever be my guide as a future scholar. Thank you.
Okay, it is my privilege to introduce a very close friend and another fellow student of John Hagedorn. Dr. Julie Globalcar studied in criminology, law, and justice with the rest of us here, and was one of Dr. Hagedorn's students. She went on to publish in areas including victim services, family violence, crime causation, and community corrections. She served as the founding chairperson of the board of Boxing Out Negativity, a highly regarded anti-violence program on Chicago's West Side, based on the grassroots effort of Coach Derek Brown. Since July 2022, she has served as a member of the Illinois Prisoner Review Board. Dr. Globalcar.
Good afternoon. I did not try to strong-arm him for people and folks. I actually very quickly said that I wanted to help memorialize Forsaking Our Children, the publication of Dr. Hagedorn's dissertation. I wanted to speak on this publication as a reminder that he was more than a gang expert. He was an activist, scholar, and human with a distinct worldview that he happened to apply most passionately and consistently to his study of gangs. In Forsaking Our Children, Bureaucracy and Reform in the Child Welfare System, which was published after People and Folks, he shares a collection of observations and lessons learned from his time serving in the Child Protective Service system in Milwaukee after being hired to design a fundamental reorientation of youth services. He did write that even before this hiring, he had spent most of the years previous helping gang kids get out of trouble as he continued to dedicate his life to and doing research for People and Folks. The venture into the bureaucracy of the child welfare system was clearly a step outside of his comfort zone, but I appreciate that he took the time to reflect and memorialize his experiences in the book for the general public to learn from what he had been through there. In Forsaking Our Children, he interrogated the question of why so many bureaucracies, quote, remain stagnant and ineffective, despite, quote, hundreds of millions of dollars, and probably billions now in other efforts as well, and a whole generation of reformers. Fundamentally, he points to the disconnect between the lived experiences of families and the work of child welfare bureaucracies. He shares, for example, one moment where he thought it might be useful to pull together all those that serve one family, and it resulted in more than 40 letters being sent out. He describes that an interview of more than 28 social workers and supervisors resulted in only one who described a typical day that included what most would view as service to families. Rather, days were filled with paperwork, supervising court orders, and investigating complaints. He critiques a lack of proactiveness in working with families to prevent rather than investigate and intervene in child abuse, a lack of lateral communications among those working with families, a focus on specialization that contributed to line workers losing sight of a holistic understanding of the families they serve, and a critique that hierarchical organizations are inherently poorly suited to maintain the agility necessary to respond to changing and uncertain conditions on the ground. He pointed to the functioning of child welfare agencies as perpetuating economic inequality, with expenditures failing to channel funds to the communities that could most benefit, observing that less than 1% of service dollars went to agencies located within the target neighborhoods. He also observed that the structure of the work, quote, all court, paperwork, made for a dissatisfying landscape of employment in which few employees made it past their 6-month probationary period. He suggests that more funding was not the solution, but rather called for changing the structure of the work itself. He argued for a move back toward the decentralization of services and direct investment in communities, arguing that services located within the neighborhoods they serve would, quote, make them, quote, more vulnerable to pressure from the local community. Not one to mince words, he argued that it would be difficult to garner greater investments in social work so long as resources were continuing to be dumped into, quote, bureaucratic black holes that devour resources but never get around to helping the poor. In sum, he paints a picture of bureaucracies that are inherently out of touch with the lived experiences within dispossessed communities, failing to fulfill the direct needs of the very families they purport to serve, perpetuating economic inequalities and the punitive ethos of state bureaucracies, while also creating a dissatisfying work environment for those who work within it. I can't say it was the text of this book itself that set the framework for my life. Rather, it was being under the influence of the ethos that was Dr. John Hagedorn that entirely transformed both my worldview and my life trajectory. Still, the book encapsulates some of the core premises that I drew from Dr. Hagedorn, which have resonated in many aspects and eras of my own work in scholarship, service, and career. In my scholarship, it informed my research on the history of probation, which originated with the good works of one man, a Boston bootmaker, who wanted to divert individuals from, quote, the dens of thieves and robbers that were jail, spending money out of his own pocket to bail individuals out and taking them into his own home to support them. John Augustus's work inspired an entire wave of reformers that called for the growth of the system of probation, who conceived it as a system in which people would have probationers over for dinner and take them out to a ball game now and again. We all see what it's turned into. Over time, the system of probation has morphed into one that is largely dissatisfying for workers, characterized by high caseloads and an emphasis on paperwork and tasks such as fee collection, and is likely to serve as a net widener as diversion from the system. Through an examination of the passage of the Federal Probation Act of 1925, I traced much of the change of the nature and spirit of probation to its adoption as part of the state apparatus. In my service work, I had the great pleasure of serving as the founding chairperson of the Board of Boxing Out Negativity, and it was, of course, Dr. Hagedorn who drew the direct line between me and North Lawndale, which I now consider my favorite small town, and for which I will forever be in gratitude to him. That is where Boxing Out Negativity is based. Unlike most anti-violence programs, it has been entirely generated and shaped in response to community demands, having existed on a grassroots basis for nearly a decade before my involvement. The organization now has a staff of about 18 employees, and as it works to adopt a baseline of policies and procedures to ensure the safeguarding of financial practices, employees, and those who come under its care, I'm constantly sharing the true north that if we lose our agility and responsiveness to community needs, we've lost the true essence, becoming, in effect, the next probation. The hegemonic, bureaucratic thinking runs deep through our culture, and we need to very thoughtfully and intentionally resist its more corrosive aspects if we intend to continue to invest in truly meaningful systems and allow those systems to flourish. And in my profession, with the great privilege of serving on Illinois' Prisoner Review Board, it's the ethos of Hagedorn, as preserved in some small part in this book, that reminds me to keep human connectedness at the center of all that I do. I see myself in every individual in custody, every victim, and every member of the public that's affected by the work. The human connectedness is my true north. Dr. Hagedorn's influence gifted me with the vision to see beyond the systems, processes, and ideologies that keep us divided. Throughout his career and his scholarship and mentorship, he continued to challenge the world to move beyond the beliefs and structures that keep us from one another. He continually reminded us, research, not stereotypes, and that people can be more than one thing. Forsaking Our Children is just one example of his lifelong endeavor to challenge those barriers that stand in the way of us realizing our common humanity. I will acknowledge that I think his lens was more naturally oriented toward seeing the fight against oppressive systems and inequality. Mine tends to be more focused on the oneness of all beings, but it's the fight against the one that creates the pathway for the realization of the vision of the other. Gangs remain at the center of some of the most entrenched stereotypes in our society, but the criminalization of those who are street involved serves as just one example of the barriers that keep us from seeing ourselves in one another and working collectively to dismantle inequalities. Forsaking Our Children reminds us of the deeper pattern that I see in Dr. Hagedorn's work, his continued call for us to find one another through the worldly barriers that serve to perpetuate injustices, inequalities, and suffering in this world. And he continually called for us to challenge those barriers relentlessly, radically, and unapologetically. And for that, I am forever grateful.
Each and every one of you have contributed something so meaningful and so significant. I know that John would be just so thrilled, right? And I'm glad we had this photo of him. I kept looking at him and seeing him and feeling him, and I think he was here with us today. So I'm sure on behalf of the family, we can't thank you enough for your inspiring, wonderful, significant remembrance and honoring of the life and work of John Hagedorn. Thank you all so much. Just really, really deep. Thank you. You know, as always, I can't do anything without the great city staff, so I want to remind them again. But we do have a little bit of time left, and we've got a couple of microphones, or at least one. So if there's anybody who wants to add any comments, we can finish up with that. Oh, I know, there was one other thing I wanted to say. I forget which of you brought up the gang website. I think you did, Benny. And so we are in the process of trying to get that back up. So thank you very much for bringing that up. And I will also say that we have someone here who came all the way from Joliet to join us, from the Warehouse Workers for Justice. She's an incredible organizer, but she too is featured on that website. And so I think that there's a lot of history on that website, and I know Mary is very committed to work with us to get that back up online. So be on the lookout for us. Okay, am I forgetting anything else? Any final things I need to do? The family again. Thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot to us that you are here. And I know that you all made great sacrifices for the world to share him with the world and to share him with us. But you at least can see that there was a great deal of significance to who he was and to his work. And for sure, we love him. We will never forget him. John Hagedorn, presente. Now, John worked organized in the factories and the neighborhoods, but so there's a farm workers clap that Lalo knows about. You were probably exposed to it, David, when you were in the Southwest. I'd like to lead us in what we call the Chicano hand clap, the farm workers hand clap. You start out very slow, and then you just sort of build up to it, and we'll end with that. Sonny and Ivory, you good? You guys are good? Okay. So we'll do it starts out very slow, and then we speed up, and with that, we honor our dear beloved John. Que viva John! Que viva! Otra vez. Que viva John! Que viva! Que viva John! Que viva! All right, presente. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. This wouldn't have been able to possible without you all coming too, so thank you.